She sent one final message that ignited nationwide panic, a message that hints danger. Within hours, a carefully planned trip unraveled into a viral missing person crisis that gripped millions. Was she a terrified victim running from a real threat? Or was the danger something far more complicated and far closer to home? As speculation exploded across social media, strangers became investigators, theories hardened into facts, and a family's worst fears played out in public. But beneath the hashtags and headlines lies a far more unsettling question. What if the truth challenges everything we thought we understood about disappearance, fear, and accountability? A deliberate missed connection. Imagine packing your bags for the ultimate bucket list trip, stepping onto an airplane with dreams of a new city, and instead stepping straight into the void. On November 8th, 2024, a 30-year-old photographer named Hana Kobayashi did exactly that. She boarded a flight departing the tropical landscape of Maui, Hawaii, destined for the concrete canyons of New York City. This journey was not a spontaneous whim. It was meticulously planned months in advance, anchored by a promising new employment opportunity and a highly anticipated reunion with her family on the East Coast. This established baseline of normalcy is absolutely crucial. It paints a picture of a woman moving purposefully toward a bright future, setting the stage for one of the most baffling disappearances in recent history. Every element of her departure suggested a woman eager to begin a new chapter, fully embracing a massive shift in her professional trajectory. Her flight touched down at Los Angeles International Airport at exactly 9:53 in the evening. She was stepping into an environment defined by extreme high-density transit and overwhelming logistical complexity. The architectural labyrinth of LAX is notoriously unforgiving to newcomers trying to traverse its vast footprint. It absolutely feels designed to disorient even the sharpest minds. Surveillance footage captured her deplaning at 10:03, leaving her a razor-thin window of just 42 minutes to navigate the sprawling terminals and board her connecting flight to John F. Kennedy International Airport scheduled for 11 o'clock. Navigating from the secure airside of the terminal to the chaotic public landside is a monumental task, even for the most seasoned traveler. It is right here, in the frantic rush of the airport terminal, that the first massive anomaly of this case presents itself. Traveling with her was her ex-boyfriend, Amun Miranda. As the minutes ticked down to departure, Amun successfully navigated the terminal, presented his boarding pass, and took his seat on the flight to New York. Hannah did not. The immediate assumption, the one naturally adopted by her frantic family, was simple logistical failure. Missing a connection by a matter of minutes in a massive aviation hub is incredibly common. She reached out, assuring her loved ones she would simply wait out the night at the airport and resolve the ticket issue in the morning. A frustrating delay, certainly, but hardly a reason to panic. Yet, as investigators began to peel back the layers of that night, a far more chilling reality emerged. A missed flight is typically a momentary setback, an accidental stumble in an otherwise concrete itinerary. But the Los Angeles Police Department would later analyze her movements, her communications, and the timeline of that evening, arriving at a deeply unsettling conclusion. They determined that her failure to board that aircraft alongside her travel companion was not an accident born of long lines or misdirection. It was intentional, a proactive tourist in hiding. Between November 9th and November 10th, the entire landscape of this investigation shifted radically, from the sterile confines of the airport terminal to the vibrant, metropolitan sprawl of Los Angeles. The narrative transformed from a stranded traveler into something altogether different. Observers looking closely at her movements during this crucial 48-hour window are struck by a glaring reality. Her actions during this period reflected the calculated, deliberate steps of a proactive tourist. On November 9th, she purposefully ventured to the Grove, a massive, highly populated retail and vibrant entertainment complex located right in the very heart of the sprawling city. She eventually made her specific way into the Taschen bookstore, a high-end retailer specializing completely in art and culture. It is exactly here that she engaged directly with the store staff, specifically asking to charge her cellular device. This single, seemingly small action is profoundly significant. It demonstrates a very clear, highly strategic awareness of her vital digital connectivity needs. She was clearly not trying to suddenly drop off the grid or simply discard her electronic devices to avoid any detection. She was actively ensuring her main lifeline to the digital world remained fully operational. Even more astonishing is what happened next. She voluntarily provided her handwritten name and physical address to the bookstore staff to join their physical mailing list. Think about that for a second. We are told later that she feared being tracked by nefarious forces. A person legitimately terrified of being hunted down, a person looking over their shoulder in genuine distress, does not willingly hand over their personal identifying information and home address to a retail mailing list. This incredibly normal consumer behavior stands in stark defiance of the terrifying narratives that would emerge just hours later. It implies a solid cognitive presence and an absolute lack of immediate fear. By November 10th, her engagement with the cultural pulse of the city intensified significantly. She embedded herself in a massive crowd at a LeBron James Nike event held right there at the Grove. She was actually captured on a YouTube video documenting the gathering, standing amidst the chaos of a high-profile marketing activation. She even took the time to post a photo from the event directly to her own Instagram account. Her family initially viewed this continued digital presence as a sign of safety, a reassuring signal that she was unreachable but behaving normally. A deeper analysis reveals the true gravity of these choices. Choosing to attend a crowded shoe promotion instead of desperately trying to rebook a cross-country flight to a brand new job and an awaiting family indicates a massive, conscious reprioritization of her life goals. She was no longer a woman trying to get to New York. As the weekend unfolded, her financial footprint began to tell an equally perplexing story. Her Venmo transaction history showed sudden, uncharacteristic anomalies. She began sending digital payments to individuals completely unknown to anyone in her life. Most notably, on November 10th, she sent money to a stranger named Jonathan Taylor, attaching a simple, single-word memo reading. Investigators and observers have widely interpreted this as payment for a tarot card reading or a spiritual consultation. This perfectly aligns with the claims she would make shortly after about undergoing an intense spiritual awakening. These deeply unusual financial transactions represent a highly critical and incredibly dangerous expansion of her social circle. She was intentionally interacting with and exchanging money with total strangers right in the very bustling heart of Los Angeles. She was actively introducing entirely new, totally unaccounted for variables into her complex life during the exact same window she was supposed to be flying across the country. Every single choice she made over those 2 days points away from a woman in danger and points directly toward a woman purposefully rewriting her own permanent itinerary, a digital smokescreen or break. On Monday, November 11th, the timeline of this investigation shatters. What initially manifested as a frustrating travel delay mutates into an urgent and terrifying missing persons crisis. The absolute catalyst for this shift is a sudden barrage of alarming, cryptic, and linguistically inconsistent text messages sent from her phone to her family and closest friends. These texts introduce wild themes of severe identity theft, malicious cyberhacking, and parapsychological experiences. This abrupt change in communication style would entirely hijack and dominate the public narrative for the next chaotic month. The most heavily scrutinized message claimed that deep hackers wiped her identity, stole all her funds, and had her caught in an intense mind since Friday. The specific phrasing utilized here is absolutely crucial to deconstruct. Deep hackers is not standard, recognized cybersecurity terminology used by professionals. It is inflammatory language pulled straight from fringe internet subcultures and paranoid conspiracy circles. Her family immediately flagged this text as a massive, terrifying departure from her typical daily speech patterns. She suddenly started using uncharacteristic pet names like Hun and Babe, terms she simply never used with her loved ones before this moment. The immediate, terrifying conclusion drawn by her frantic family and early social media observers was entirely understandable. They believed she was being physically coerced and held against her will. They theorized her phone had been hijacked by a dangerous third party, pulling the strings, dictating bizarre messages to buy time or orchestrate a ransom. But we must actively push ourselves to look far beyond the terrifying surface level of a literal kidnapping scenario. Law enforcement eventually adopted a radically different lens to view these events. They suggested these erratic messages were either the deliberate construction of a digital smokescreen designed to cover her planned disappearance, or the undeniable manifestation of a severe psychological pivot. In tandem with the wild hacking claims, she sent messages detailing a profound internal shift, claiming she had just finished a very intense spiritual awakening. She directly juxtaposed this sudden, supposed spiritual enlightenment with dark claims of being aggressively intercepted and financially tricked. This juxtaposition creates a deeply confusing, fragmented narrative of violently conflicting emotional states. She even began referencing the Matrix, a concept heavily utilized in modern internet discourse to describe suddenly escaping a fabricated societal construct. We have to fiercely debate the true nature of this sudden communicative crisis. The general public immediately and passionately latched onto the highly sensational idea of an international human trafficking ring. But this collective reaction fundamentally exposes a massive systemic societal failure in our basic mental health literacy. When directly confronted with a sudden, uncharacteristic outpouring of paranoid ideation and disjointed spiritual grandiosity, the immediate public instinct was to literalize the invisible threat. People chose to invent shadowy syndicates rather than accurately recognize the glaring, textbook signs of severe, overwhelming psychological stress. We must deeply consider the strong possibility that these frantic texts were not the forced dictation of a violent kidnapper, but rather deeply maladaptive coping mechanisms. If she was caught in a devastating financial or personal crisis, projecting a grand narrative of cyber hacking and spiritual transcendence might have been the only way her fractured mind could process the crushing reality of her actual situation. The unfortunate lack of broader public understanding regarding exactly how profound psychological distress actually manifests and distorts digital communication caused millions of well-meaning people to completely misread the obvious signals. They spent weeks desperately searching the shadows for phantom criminals, while tragically missing the profound internal collapse happening right in front of them. The metro and baggage claim, the final physical evidence of her actual presence in Los Angeles, materialized on the evening of November 11th through stark surveillance footage captured directly at the busy Metro Pico station right near the Crypto.com arena. This specific video instantly became the absolute most intensely scrutinized piece of visual evidence in the entire sprawling investigation, because it clearly showed her walking in the direct physical company of an unidentified man. Her distraught family publicly and vehemently stated that she simply did not look like her normal self in this recording, aggressively insisting she appeared to be in a deep, visible state of severe distress and very extreme disorientation. The sheer unsettling presence of this shadowy unknown individual operating alongside her erratic, paranoid text messages acted as an absolute blazing accelerant for massive public panic. Vicious, rampant theories of highly coordinated human trafficking and violent, targeted abduction exploded across every single major social media platform for several agonizing weeks on end. Millions of dedicated online observers became entirely convinced they were watching a truly terrified hostage being actively managed and controlled by a highly dangerous criminal handler right in the very middle of downtown Los Angeles. We must forcefully pivot away from that viral panic and lay out the cold, hard data that police brought to light. Upon conducting a thorough investigation into the metro station footage, detectives successfully identified and tracked down this heavily debated companion. They subjected him to a comprehensive interview. The man completely and fully cooperated, and police were able to meticulously verify his entire account of their interaction. The terrifying criminal handler theory completely evaporated. It was determined that the two individuals had simply met organically at the airport terminal and had chosen to travel together through the transit system. They even spent time sleeping on public benches inside Union Station. This individual was completely cleared of any criminal activity or malicious intent whatsoever. His fleeting physical presence was simply the direct and immediate result of the highly transient social interactions she was willingly engaging in during her week wandering the vast city. Then we dropped the absolute hammer with the single most overlooked and fiercely underreported piece of crucial forensic evidence in this entire massively complicated missing persons case. On that exact same chaotic day, November 11th, she actively returned all the way back to the massive Los Angeles International Airport to personally retrieve her checked luggage. She had previously initiated direct contact with the commercial airline to explicitly request that they painstakingly return her heavy bags all the way from New York directly back to California. This specific, highly coordinated logistical maneuver absolutely confirms her firm, calculated intent to remain localized in the Southern California region rather than ever continuing her original, heavily planned flight path. Crucial, high-definition surveillance footage clearly showed her standing right there alone at the bustling baggage carousel, physically picking up her own heavy bag. She was appearing completely physically unharmed, totally unbothered, and clearly acting entirely of her own free and independent volition. We must aggressively demand that every single member of the listening audience confront this massive, undeniable logistical reality directly head-on today. Does a truly terrified, heavily monitored hostage actively return alone to a massively secure, heavily policed international airport to politely visit baggage claim and carefully manage their own incredibly complex travel logistics? A completely passive physical victim of a violent, organized abduction simply does not successfully coordinate massive cross-country luggage transfers. This deliberate, highly calculated logistical act serves as the absolute definitive proof that she was not a helpless captive being violently dragged through the dangerous city, but was instead a highly capable, intelligent adult, proactively managing her own heavy physical possessions to carefully prepare for an entirely new, completely self-directed international travel objective alone: the border crossing information lag. On November 12th, at approximately 12:13 in the afternoon, the absolute turning point of this entire frantic investigation silently materialized. We can track her movements with absolute precision as she utilized her own physical passport and hard cash to explicitly purchase a designated bus ticket. She deliberately traveled down to the massive San Ysidro port of entry, securely located at the extreme southern edge of California. High-definition federal surveillance footage routinely captured by United States Customs and Border Protection undeniably recorded her physically walking entirely alone straight through the highly crowded pedestrian tunnel directly into Tijuana, Mexico. She was clearly seen diligently carrying her own heavy personal luggage and firmly appeared to be moving forward completely without any visible external coercion whatsoever. This precise recorded moment represents the exact juncture where the terrified public narrative of a violent Los Angeles kidnapping completely shatters against the cold, hard reality of a deeply calculated international departure. Yet, this is exactly where the profound structural outrage of this entire complex legal case must be aggressively directed by every single critical observer. This definitive international border crossing actively occurred on November 12th, which was the exact same day her terrified family officially filed a desperate missing persons report with the local authorities. However, the agonizing public did not receive a single piece of this absolutely critical information until December 2nd. That is an astonishing, catastrophic, 3-week information lag, completely buried right in the middle of a massive, highly publicized, global missing persons search effort. We must deeply and aggressively dissect the severe systemic failure and the massive interagency jurisdictional friction that actively created this devastating, prolonged vacuum of vital investigative information. While this incredibly crucial video evidence simply sat, locked away safely inside a dark federal database, thousands of highly dedicated civilian volunteers and her own increasingly desperate, exhausted father were frantically scouring the common, highly dangerous, sprawling urban streets of Los Angeles. They were operating entirely under the terrifying but completely false assumption that she was trapped in imminent deadly danger right there inside the sprawling city limits. This horrific, massive institutional delay was officially attributed to the painfully slow bureaucratic time strictly required for the local municipal police department to carefully coordinate heavily with massive federal border authorities, and then eventually physically travel all the way down to the distant southern border crossing just to formally review the existing digital footage. The glaring fact that a specialized local detective agency simply cannot instantaneously access critical federal border departure data during the absolutely crucial first 48 hours of a high-profile missing persons investigation stands as an absolute systemic failure of monumental administrative proportions. This agonizingly slow interagency friction completely destroyed the initial strategic search radius and successfully allowed a massive, dangerous vortex of terrifying public panic to violently consume the entire massive Los Angeles metropolitan area. In adult missing persons cases, the fundamental established legal right to simply walk away and intentionally be missing frequently limits the aggressive operational speed of rapid interagency data sharing. But that rigid protective legal protocol actively manufactured a devastating 3-week waking nightmare for a deeply desperate family structure that was actively tearing themselves entirely apart, searching a sprawling city she had already abandoned permanently. They spent countless agonizing hours printing flyers, knocking on unfamiliar doors, and screaming into the digital void, while the absolute definitive proof of her safe, solitary international departure just sat quietly collecting bureaucratic dust every day. The severe structural disconnect between these massive law enforcement agencies created pure, preventable tragedy, the viral digital vigilante explosion. The case of Hana Kobayashi did not merely exist as a localized missing persons investigation filed away in a police precinct. It became an absolute viral sensation that violently detonated across global digital platforms, particularly dominating the algorithm-driven landscapes of TikTok and Facebook. Millions of strangers suddenly adopted this incredibly complex personal crisis as their own daily true crime obsession. A massive digital mobilization effort rapidly formed under the banner of a dedicated Help Us Find Hana movement. The sheer scale of public generosity and intense focus was staggering to witness. A dedicated crowdfunding campaign swiftly raised nearly $50,000 to directly assist the desperate family in their grueling physical search efforts across the vast expanse of Los Angeles. Her sister and aunt skillfully utilized this very unprecedented wave of intense public interest to maintain maximum external pressure on local and federal law enforcement agencies. This massive influx of financial resources and relentless media spotlight showcased the absolute best elements of modern crowdsourced investigations, demonstrating how collective empathy can force a massive bureaucratic system to prioritize a single missing individual over all other active police cases occurring simultaneously. But this massive digital machine possesses a highly volatile dual nature. The very same platforms that provided crucial funding and global awareness quickly mutated into a chaotic and highly toxic informational nightmare. The investigation was rapidly hijacked by an army of online sleuths engaging in unchecked digital vigilantism. These amateur investigators began aggressively developing and loudly broadcasting a wide range of highly sensational theories that completely drowned out the established factual evidence. The terrifying human trafficking narrative took absolute priority in the public consciousness, relying heavily on those disjointed early text messages mentioning intercepted funds and cyber interference. Massive online communities became entirely convinced she was being physically held against her will by an organized international crime syndicate operating in plain sight. When the completely baseless human trafficking narrative inevitably failed to yield any immediate or tangible physical evidence for authorities to pursue, the highly speculative digital frenzy simply pivoted aggressively toward exploring even more bizarre and thoroughly outlandish conceptual territory. A massive secondary theory emerged, suggesting she had been actively brainwashed and recruited by a dangerous New Age cult, frequently drawing direct comparisons to the infamous Twin Flames organization. This specific speculative leap was entirely fueled by her strange, out-of-character text messages, vaguely referencing a sudden, intense spiritual awakening and escaping the societal matrix. Then came an entirely unsupported, but incredibly viral rumor involving an African hacker network engaging in complex international blackmail. These wild theories were presented as absolute truth in thousands of viral videos, creating a massive digital echo chamber completely divorced from the actual physical investigation happening on the ground. We must critically dissect this modern phenomenon of crowdsourced digital investigations as a profoundly dangerous double-edged sword. The sheer volume of digital noise generated by millions of speculative observers severely hampered the actual physical search effort by burying legitimate leads under a mountain of internet folklore. The intense, unyielding public scrutiny eventually turned incredibly dark and hostile toward the very people it initially sought to help. The family members who had actively cultivated this massive online community suddenly found themselves on the receiving end of vicious online harassment and terrifying real-world death threats. The very same digital vigilantism that funded their desperate search ultimately forced the terrified family to completely shutter their primary support group just to ensure their own physical safety. This incredibly toxic dynamic perfectly illustrates how an unchecked viral true crime obsession can actively exacerbate the profound psychological trauma of a grieving family and directly endanger the precise people it claims to protect, transforming a desperate search into an unmanageable online spectacle that causes permanent, devastating harm to everyone involved in the relentless pursuit of internet fame and highly speculative digital entertainment broadcasting globally. Ambiguous loss and unresolved trauma. The search for Hana Kobayashi reached its most devastating and heartbreaking nadir on November 24th, fundamentally shifting this narrative from a perplexing mystery into an absolute tragedy. After 13 agonizing days of relentlessly scouring the vast, unforgiving streets of Los Angeles, handing out thousands of flyers to passing strangers, Ryan Kobayashi was found dead in a concrete parking structure situated right near the massive international airport. The local county medical examiner ultimately ruled his tragic death a suicide. This incredibly dark, devastating core of the entire narrative demands our deepest empathy and our most serious analytical attention. We cannot view his death as a mere tragic footnote to his daughter leaving. We must look closely at the catastrophic destruction of his psychological well-being during those 13 days. He was a father desperate to protect his child, thrown into a chaotic environment that systematically dismantled his natural coping mechanisms. The profound psychological horror of his final 2 weeks is almost impossible to fully comprehend. Family members described a man who essentially died of a profoundly broken heart, a father suffering from severe, acute sleep deprivation while carrying the absolute crushing weight of endless internet speculation regarding the terrible fate of his daughter. The relentless physical exhaustion of walking endless city blocks, combined lethally with the highly toxic digital noise surrounding the investigation, every single day, without an answer, aggressively eroded his baseline mental stability. When basic mental health literacy is applied to this horrifying scenario, we can clearly see a human mind being stretched far beyond its absolute breaking point. The vicious, unfounded rumors of international trafficking and shadowy cults actively replacing factual reality acted as a violent psychological poison, thoroughly fracturing his perception of the world and leaving him stranded in a waking nightmare of terrifying uncertainty. To truly understand this devastating outcome, we must firmly ground this chapter in the complex clinical psychology of ambiguous loss. This specific psychological phenomenon occurs when a loved one is physically entirely missing from the world, yet remains powerfully, overwhelmingly present in the psychological landscape of the left-behind family members. Unlike a physical death where a clear, definitive ending allows the natural grieving process to slowly begin, ambiguous loss provides absolutely zero closure. The human mind simply cannot tolerate this severe cognitive dissonance indefinitely. The brain desperately attempts to resolve the paralyzing paradox of a person being both gone and virtually present, creating a relentless cycle of fleeting hope and profound despair. This ongoing, unresolvable trauma aggressively attacks a person's core psychological well-being, effectively stripping away their ability to process reality safely. Without any definitive answers to anchor him, Ryan was trapped in a relentless psychological purgatory. As the days dragged on, whatever healthy coping mechanisms he possessed were completely overwhelmed by the sheer magnitude of the unresolved trauma. The tragic, absolute fatal cost of this profound ambiguity ultimately manifested directly in his heartbreaking final decision. When a person is deprived of sleep, deprived of truth, and subjected to the relentless barrage of public scrutiny, the mental foundation simply collapses. This event became a highly controversial and deeply painful focal point for thousands of critics who later struggled immensely to reconcile the massive, ultimate sacrifice of a devoted father with the eventual discovery that his daughter had actually executed a completely voluntary departure across an international border. That intensely uncomfortable friction between his devastating death and her calculated survival continues to heavily haunt the legacy of this entire complex investigation. We must recognize his tragedy as a stark, undeniable lesson regarding the incredible fragility of the human mind when subjected to the prolonged terror of an unsolved disappearance. His deeply tragic end powerfully illustrates the lethal real-world consequences of digital vigilantism and the absolute limit of parental endurance. The heavy toll of ambiguous loss is not merely an abstract psychological concept discussed in clinical settings, but a literal, physical danger that can quickly consume the families left behind in the chaotic wake of a sudden, unexplained departure. The search for a missing person is not just a geographical challenge, it is a severe psychological crisis that desperately demands immense, immediate, clinical support from trained professionals, a highly illegal financial deal. Just as the physical search officially concluded in the sprawling streets of Los Angeles, a massive investigative bombshell completely detonated the established narrative. The entire focus shifted violently from a desperate missing persons case to the deeply complex, highly illegal world of transnational immigration fraud. Investigative outlets uncovered a staggering new layer that fundamentally rewrote the motive behind her deliberate disappearance. A mere 2 weeks before she ever packed her bags for that supposed bucket list trip to New York City, she allegedly married an Argentinian citizen named Alan Tomas Cacas. This was not a sudden, whirlwind romantic elopement. Reports strongly indicated this was a highly calculated sham marriage, directly intended to illegally secure a United States green card for her new husband. The alleged financial architecture of this illicit arrangement provides the exact missing context that investigators had been desperately searching for from the very beginning. The structure of the deal was simple but carried massive legal risks. She was reportedly paid a flat fee of $15,000 up front for her initial participation in the fraudulent ceremony. An additional $15,000 was promised to her upon the successful, final confirmation of his permanent legal status. Suddenly, the intended trip to the East Coast completely transforms from a casual family reunion into a high-stakes evidence-gathering mission. The traveling party heading to New York was reportedly a bizarre love square. It consisted of Hannah, her former boyfriend Amun Miranda, who allegedly orchestrated the entire arrangement, her new sham husband Alan, and Marianne, who was actually Alan's real girlfriend. The entire purpose of navigating the city together was purportedly to take staged photographs of the newly married couple standing in front of famous tourist landmarks. They were actively attempting to manufacture a highly convincing paper trail of a genuine, loving relationship to eventually present to strict federal immigration officials. The absolutely definitive proof of this highly elaborate, orchestrated scheme did not magically originate from random internet sleuths frantically posting unverified rumors online. It actually emerged directly from her own quiet childhood home located back in Hawaii. While desperately searching for any tiny shred of an explanation regarding her missing daughter, her mother, Brandy Yee, physically discovered a massive, undeniably concrete cache of forensic documentary evidence carefully hidden away inside the residence. She successfully uncovered highly official, heavily detailed immigration documents alongside direct, ongoing written correspondence, completely linking her to a specialized, practicing immigration attorney. These incredibly damning, highly sensitive legal files were immediately handed straight over to the Federal Bureau of Investigation. This explosive discovery instantly drew massive, overwhelming federal investigative resources directly into what was initially being treated merely as a standard, localized missing persons file. We must critically re-examine every single piece of bizarre digital communication sent from her phone through this entirely new, highly financial lens. When we look back at those frantic, terrified text messages claiming she had been severely tricked and that her funds were completely stolen, the narrative suddenly crystallizes into sharp focus. Those deeply alarming messages were never the paranoid ramblings of a woman targeted by a sophisticated network of cybercriminals. They were the very real, very desperate fallout of a highly illegal transnational financial deal completely blowing up right in her face. The intense spiritual awakening and the sudden desire to escape the matrix were likely just desperate psychological shields. She was a woman realizing the massive legal and financial peril she had willingly walked into, choosing to vanish across an international border rather than face the disastrous consequences of a federal scam failing, a skeptical safe return home. On December 11th, the Los Angeles Police Department officially confirmed the news that shattered the month-long missing persons investigation. They announced she had been located entirely safe and unharmed across the border in Mexico. This sudden revelation brought an immediate halt to the frantic physical search, but simultaneously detonated a massive wave of intense familial and public tension. Her own sister publicly reported experiencing a profound sense of deep betrayal, revealing that while she was physically secure, she firmly did not wish to return to her family at that specific time. The highly anticipated emotional reunion simply never happened. 4 days later, on Sunday, December 15th, she finally chose to cross back into the United States. She traversed the international border right at daybreak, but she did not walk into the desperate, waiting arms of the devastated family members who had spent agonizing weeks tearing their lives apart, looking for her. Instead, she was met immediately by her retained legal attorney in California. Federal authorities briefly detained her upon re-entry, merely to formally verify her identity and baseline physical well-being before the local police department officially closed their active case file. The stark, undeniable visual of a suddenly located woman returning from a massive disappearance to immediately rendezvous with strict legal counsel rather than her grieving relatives speaks volumes about the true underlying nature of her initial departure. In her initial public statements released shortly after crossing the border, she emphasized a strong personal need for individual healing, quiet peace, and ongoing creativity. The most highly debated and heavily scrutinized aspect of her entire return was her firm insistence that she remained entirely unaware of the massive media frenzy, the millions of digital sleuths, and the devastating tragedy involving her father while she was disconnected down in Mexico. She painted a picture of total isolation from the modern digital world during a highly chaotic period when her specific face was actively dominating daily international news cycles. We must directly challenge this specific narrative and press the strict bounds of logical belief. The widespread public skepticism surrounding her claims of total absolute ignorance is absolutely deafening today. Her specific face was literally one of the top trending global news stories actively circulating in both the United States and Mexico throughout her entire prolonged absence. In our current modern era of constant, inescapable digital connectivity, the sheer statistical improbability of remaining completely oblivious to a massive international search campaign bearing your exact name is staggering. People rightfully struggle to reconcile her casual demand for peace with the absolute destruction left in her wake. She later asserted to major media outlets that she completely knows her truth and plans to share it eventually, casually brushing off intense public criticism regarding her perceived severe lack of personal accountability by loudly insisting the critical public simply lacks the whole, extremely complicated story. But we have to look closely at the undeniable wreckage she left behind and aggressively ask ourselves a very hard, highly uncomfortable truth about modern accountability today. Do you genuinely buy her polished story of total innocent isolation? Or are we actively witnessing a highly calculated attempt to completely avoid the massive, devastating social and familial repercussions that will inevitably follow her for many years to come? The true cost of disappearance. The massive investigation into Hana Kobayashi provides several extremely critical lessons for law enforcement and the general public regarding the highly complex, evolving dynamics of modern adult missing persons cases. At the very center of this sprawling narrative is the profoundly difficult legal problem of the voluntary missing adult. Under current law, an adult possesses the fundamental right to simply disappear and completely disconnect from their safely established daily life and extended family structure. This legal reality creates a massive hurdle for local law enforcement agencies who are forced to carefully balance a person's strict right to privacy against a desperate family's agonizing need to know if their loved one is actually safe. The official decision to reclassify her sudden departure as voluntary was an absolute legal necessity once the border footage was finally reviewed, but it painfully highlights the massive emotional gap existing between rigid police protocols and desperate familial expectations. This case also serves as the ultimate cautionary tale regarding how terrifyingly fast digital folklore and viral internet speculation can completely outpace an official physical investigation. The incredibly cryptic text messages sent during her final hours in Los Angeles acted as a massive psychological test for the entire watching public. To some frantic observers, those texts were absolute, undeniable proof of a high-tech, violent abduction, while to others they were merely a poorly constructed excuse, desperately attempting to cover up a failed international financial scam. The catastrophic 3-week delay in reviewing federal border footage represents a glaring systemic failure in interagency cooperation that directly allowed this dangerous digital noise to flourish unchecked. When local police cannot instantly verify international border crossings in high-profile cases, thousands of agonizing hours are completely wasted, and the psychological collapse of the physical search party becomes almost inevitable. The heavily alleged marriage fraud scheme provides the only logical framework for the bizarre behavior observed throughout that fateful week. If she was buckling under the intense pressure of a highly illegal financial arrangement, suddenly going horribly wrong, her erratic messages about stolen funds and feeling deeply tricked suddenly become incredibly coherent. Her claims of a sudden profound spiritual awakening were likely just a desperate psychological coping mechanism designed to mask a very real and legally disastrous financial predicament. Ultimately, we must deeply contemplate the absolute terrifying fragility of the human psyche when caught squarely between a disastrous personal choice and the relentless viral machinery of modern global social media. The chaotic intersection of personal failure and public spectacle creates a level of devastating collateral damage that simply cannot be undone once the digital spotlight turns its blinding focus onto a private crisis.